Hi everyone, welcome to the Princeton Review's webinar, Unlocking Your Best MCAT Score. My name is Valerie and I'm part of the Princeton Review's national marketing team. I'll be co-hosting our presentation tonight along with Doug McLemore. All right, so before we get started, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items with you guys. So just so you know, everyone's lines are muted. So if you have a question or if there's something you'd like to share with us, please use the question box located in your GoToWebinar menu bar. Also, we're going to do our best to get through everyone's questions tonight, but if we're unable to answer yours, just rest assured that one of our med admissions experts will actually be following up with you after tonight's webinar. Additionally, tonight's session is actually being recorded, so there's no need to take notes. Each one of you will be receiving a copy of tonight's webinar recording within 48 hours. So sit back, enjoy, and learn some strategies. All right, Doug, will you hit the next slide for me, please? All right, so this slide is just to show you guys how we're going to be equally representing our East and West Coast folks tonight. Like I said, my name is Valerie and I'm based out of the New York office, and our MCAT expert, Doug McLemore, is based out of California. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to pass it along to Doug so he can give you guys all a little bit of background on his experience. Take it away, Doug.
Hello everybody, I hope everybody's doing well tonight. My name is Doug McLemore and I am over here in the Bay Area, Berkeley office to be specific. I've been with Princeton Review now for about 10 years, and before that I come by way of having been a university faculty at some school in Colorado. And so where I've been coming from, I've had this background trying to help students do better in college. And when I made the transition into Princeton Review, I was looking more into helping my students get from college into those next endeavors, such as med school, which is why we're here tonight, to learn a little bit about the MCAT and what you can do to improve your scores on your MCAT. So before we get started with that, I want to sort of open the door here for some questions that we have for you, just to get to know a little bit about you guys. So the first question I'm going to ask you is a poll here about when you plan on applying to med school. So if you can go ahead and in the pop-up that just came up about the poll, go ahead and tell us a little bit about when you're planning to apply. Looks like there's a handful of folks right now that are already applied, but mostly this upcoming cycle looks to be the most important one. We got about 80% voted. I'll see if we can get that a little bit higher. 85%, 87%. We can get that around 90%. Then we'll move on to our next question. All righty. So it looks like most of us are going to be applying in this upcoming cycle. That's good, or at least in the next cycle. Let me go ahead and close that one down. And then I'm going to ask a second question. When are you planning on taking your MCAT? So let's launch that next poll here. Again, just a handful that have already taken it. Most of our folks look like they're planning on June, which means likely you plan on getting that MCAT done for your application, and so you can get your application in that June era or June time. That's always a good time to do it. It looks like we got about 90% voted. If you were voting in the questions, I see some of you might be doing that. Make sure you're voting in the pop-up window that is coming up. All right, so let me go ahead and close that one down. And we can get on to what we're really here for, which is to learn about this test for those, the more than half of you guys that are taking this test coming up here very shortly. So to really get to know the MCAT is to do better on the MCAT. So that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time on right now, is to look at what the MCAT is all about, what's on the MCAT, and sort of determine our best strategies towards attacking it intelligently. So to do that, we need to know that there's 4 sections. We've got our 3 sciences sections. The first, the third, and the fourth section are going to be your chem phys, is what we call it, because it's a lot of words there. biochem, and then psych-soc would be our three science sections. Notice they're all 59 questions each, 95 minutes per section. That averages about 1.5 minutes per question. So you'll have about 1.5 minutes, including the time it takes to dig through the passage to answer the questions on those sections. And then the cars section, which is the second section, also the one that's most difficult for most people. We see the average is lowest on the section across the board, is 53 questions in 90 minutes. The thing to remember here is that it's actually 9 passages, so you have 10 minutes per passage. That's the better way to think about this section because it simply has all reading comprehension, all passage-based, so you should be focused on how much time per passage rather than time per question on this one. So 10 minutes per passage that you have to complete cars. The score range is 118 to 132 for each of the sections, which if you think about it is if you look at the middle, that's 125. 125 is 50th percentile on any of the sections. And if you add that all up, that gives you a total possible of 472 to 528, which will give you a 500 on the overall score if you're hitting the 50th percentile. Now, that's not necessarily the score you want to target because what we're seeing is that it's very similar to what we've seen in past years before it was the new MCAT. To be competitive, you want to have somewhere around an 80th percentile or so. And the 80th percentile, at least for the next month, is around 508, 509. And in some places, you probably want to be a little bit higher than that, such as California, New York. It's a little bit more competitive. You're probably looking to have a target score of around 510, 511, so that you're basically making sure you're in that competitive range to get an interview. That's the sort of holy grail of taking the MCAT, to be honest. So how do we do that? The score is based on the total number of correct answers. So since there's, based on the total number of correct answers and there's 4 multiple choice answers, if you have to guess, there is at least that 25% chance about getting into getting the question right if you simply guess. And since there is no guessing penalty on the test, you should never leave any individual question blank. So first test strategy that I'm teaching you tonight is simply make sure that you know what your goal score is. Make sure you're answering enough questions, which is roughly about 70 to 80% of the questions accurately and correctly to get your target score, and the rest of the questions just simply answer everything. Answer everything. Even if you're completely guessing, never leave an answer blank. We usually call it letter of the day, so you just pick B and just go with B the entire time. And so that way you have your best chance of maximizing even a couple more points out of the test than you might have otherwise gotten. So it's a nice way to do that. Now, to know the test is to know the timing of the test as well as what else is going on that day. So let's learn a little bit about that. The first thing you do is you get to the examinee agreement. And much like when signing a mortgage or some important piece of paper like your lease, you probably did not read the whole thing. And it's probably going to be the same for your examinee agreement. Just simply sign it and move on. Because if you do your prep correctly, you should be taking at least a handful of practice tests. We suggest 5 or more before you take your real test. And during those practice tests, you have read this examinee agreement, you understand what it is, so you know what you're agreeing to. So don't really waste much time here. The tutorial, same deal. If you've been practicing like you should understand how the test works and how all the tools work. So the tutorial is pretty unimportant. However, we still want you to do it. We want you to actually do and start the tutorial, but not answer the questions and do the things it's asking you to do. No, let's do this smart. Let's actually take some time here during this 10-minute tutorial and create ourselves a dump sheet. All those equations that you need for your Chem Phys section, which is the first thing coming up, this is when you just put on your scratch paper all those equations you can think of. You're creating yourself a little cheat sheet that you can use for the rest of the test. So just use those 10 minutes wisely. There's no real need for you to do it to figure out how the test works. So that is a nice way to use your time effectively. Then you get down to the Chem Phys section and you do your 59 questions in 95 minutes. And a good suggestion here is to use what we call the 2-pass system. Don't do all the questions in order. Don't simply start with question 1, then question 2, then question 3, then question 4. On a passage-by-passage basis, make a decision. Should I do this passage now, or should I do this passage later? If you think you should do the passage now, literally answer the questions now, and then get on to the next passage. If you think you should do it later, then you should just pick letter of the day for each of the answer choices, or each of the questions, and then move on. But while you're doing that, use the mark tool, and we'll show you what the mark tool looks like here in a little bit. But don't do things in order. Skip around in the section. Do the things that are going to give you some confidence ahead of time. Like make sure you're doing those easier questions first, so when you actually get to the harder stuff, you've already gotten a lot of questions correct, and you've already gotten a lot of things, got a lot of momentum built up in the test. So that's what we call the 2-pass method. Then you get your optional break. This is not an optional break in my mind. You should definitely do this break. Get up, get the blood pumping, because, you know, you're mostly probably biology people. You're just sitting there and your blood's pooling in your feet. You don't have the optimal blood pressure in your body, so the blood's not getting your brain like that. Get around, get moving around, get that blood up and into your brain again. And then also make sure you try to go to the bathroom. If you don't go to the bathroom here, you might end up halfway through the cars section going like, oh man, I really have to go to the bathroom, and that's just going to be very difficult to stay focused and focusing on the things you need to during the car section, which is reading carefully. So go to the bathroom. Don't talk to anybody is the other thing I would suggest to you here. If you talk to other individuals, they might actually end up freaking you out a little bit because they're like, oh my God, this is just a crazy test. Oh my God. You know how people get when they're in a stressful environment. And so you do not want to be around those other people stressing you out during this break. Just get up, walk around, do a lap, go to the restroom, avoid talking to other people, and then come back and do the cars section. And there you go. That's the best way to be prepared for cars. So you come in, you do cars. This is the section that's going to tax you the most. So take a little bit of time. Just get set at your computer when you get back from your break. Get yourself ready and go like, I got this. I'm going to do great. I'm just going to dig right in. So get that car section up and out of the way, and then you got your optional lunch break. This is, not an optional thing. Go to the bathroom. Don't talk to other people. Leave your cell phone in the car because you get to go to your locker at this point. And I've heard many a horror story where somebody just went to their locker, grabbed their cell phone just to take a glance at it, and immediately were disqualified. So if you get disqualified, then it doesn't matter how well you did on your previous 2 sections, then you're out of luck. So leave the cell phone in the car. Don't keep that in the locker with you. Have your lunch there, however. So things to have in your lunch are not things like Red Bull, things like Monster, things like coffee, soda. What you do want to have in there are things that are like complex carbs and protein, of all things. And back when I was a kid, we used to have this stuff called Gorp. Don't know if you all remember what that was. It's a good camping food, good old raisins and peanuts. Raisins and peanuts have those complex carbs and that protein to give you good stamina for the rest of the test. So take that full 30-minute break, get some food in you, get your restroom thing going on, and then get back in there and go do the section you know you love, at least most of you, which is the biochem. This is a bit of a more fun section for a lot of folks. They just get in here and they end up having an easier time, which is good because this is the time where you're going to start fatiguing. Again, you got your optional break. Go do the same things. Don't talk to anybody. Go ahead and use the restroom and then come back and then sit down and get your psych-soc section done. For each of these sections, by the way, you're still doing the 2-pass method, going through answering only the passages that you're ready to answer right now and then leaving the other ones for a second pass through. Because, again, building momentum, very helpful to keeping your stamina up. So once you get through that, you get the void question. There's only really 2 good reasons to select void. Because what happens if you use the void, it does show that you've taken an MCAT and voided the test. So it isn't something that just makes it appear as if you've never taken the MCAT before. The only two good reasons here is if you're violently ill, and so like there's some kind of, you're either vomiting or some other type of explosive situation going on during your test that's going to make you just basically do terrible. So the only reason, that would be one good reason to do it. The only other reason to use this void question would be if you have a testing abnormality. And that would be if, say, the testing center actually had a internet problem, say. And what they will do is they will have you sit there and wait because the test requires internet to work. So you'll wait and you'll wait and you wait, and it can be upwards of 2 hours that I've heard some of my students say they've had to wait before they actually started taking the test again. So the test wasn't a 7.5 hour test for them. It was like a 10-hour test for them because they had all that waiting time. The AMC understands that stuff happens, and that is not a reason why they would ever give you an abnormal testing administration. So if that is enough, if that stressed you out enough that you're not going to do well, that would be the time to use your void question. Then you get onto the satisfaction survey. This is that one thing that you probably don't have to spend too much time on because they're just really asking you, how did you like our test? Did you feel like it was fair? Did you feel like you were well prepared, this, that, and the other thing? So go through that if you want. If you don't, just this is the time to shave some time off your test time and get the heck out of there. So then your total content time is going to be 6.25 hours. So that's how much your brain has to be working the whole time. Overall seated time when you're going to be in the testing room is going to be 7.5 hours, which seems like it's not that bad, but you got to tack on a half hour at the beginning because you're going to get there early to the testing center. You've got to tack on time for just like potential issues that come up. So this is a full day. You're going to be spending a full work day, if you will, of time working on the MCAT. So that also means when you're doing practice that you should practice it the exact same way. Plan those days out so you have a full work day available for you to do your practice tests. So let's talk about some of the tools that you do have for you on the test itself. Notice how the questions are delivered one at a time on the right side of the screen. The passage is delivered on the left side of the screen, and it does scroll. And the scrolling, one of the things you'll notice, it doesn't have a scroll bar. So you will have to make sure you check just in case. Like this one's pretty clear that there's something cut off here, so I've got to scroll down. But other times it might not be clear because the break comes at a paragraph break or something like that. So make sure you scroll down and then you see the whole passage. Another part to notice is the thing we call the blurb down here. The blurb tells you a little bit about what's in the passage without having to do any reading. You just go down here and say, it looks like this study is about glycogen storage disease type 1. Makes me think that the content that I'm probably going to be tested on has something to do with glycogen metabolism. So at least it will get me in the right frame of mind. I know this is probably a biochemistry or bio-related passage. Maybe an organic chemistry question in here as well. So pay attention to that little blurb. It can help get you in the right frame of mind for the questions you're going to run into here. Notice also there's this periodic table button. So once you see the periodic table button and you click it, up pops the periodic table. Periodic table button shows on all the sections of the test except for the cars section. You will not see the periodic table on cars. You could use it, I suppose, on a psych-soc question. I just can't think of any examples of a psych-soc question that would require you to understand the different elements that go into something. But it is available on all 3 science sections. The thing you have to remember is when you hit close, it will disappear, and you have to always remember to bring it back when you need it. Another tool available to you is highlighting. And highlighting is a more complicated tool than it used to be. And if you are using a touchpad to do your practicing, I would strongly encourage you to go purchase a 2-button mouse for your computer because it takes 2 buttons to highlight. You would take your left button, click and drag, and you get this blue highlighting, and then you got to click the right button on this little icon down here, and then I'll turn it yellow. So it's a left click, drag, right click to cause the highlighting to stick around and retain for the next time you see this passage. It's like if you go backwards or forwards through it. If you try to do that on a touchpad, that is very difficult to do, and it is a very different activity from what you're going to have at the testing center. because at the testing center you will have a regular 2-button mouse. So when you're doing your practicing, you should actually use that 2-button mouse while practicing as well. A nice feature is you can now highlight in the question stem. So when it's got some important information in the question stem, you can highlight that to help remind you of what you're looking for. So the important concept here is that the plasma glucose levels are approximately equal to blood glucose. So that tells you a little something that you need to solve the question. Another tool is the strikeout tool. The strikeout tool is nice because it helps you eliminate answer choices. So you can say, okay, it's not answer choice A, it's not answer choice C, so I can just right-click on those answers for that to happen. The annoying part of the strikeout tool is you can still select answer A and you can still select answer C because it'll still allow you to select those answer choices. So even though you strike out, you could still actually pick the wrong answer choice. So just be careful, be aware of what you're doing when you come to strike out and pick your final answer choice. So that for the most part, those are the important features up here in this part of the window. Down here at the bottom, you'll have the previous and the next. That'll go from the next question to the next question, or to the previous question, remembering that the questions are delivered one at a time. If you do skip a question, the mark button is right here. This earmarks the question as being something you want to go back and revisit when you go to the review button here, which brings up a list of all of the different questions on the test, as well as whether you did answer them, whether you did not answer them, and whether they were marked. So it's actually a very rapid way to jump around the section. If you want to get back to a previous question, click the review button, click on the question number in the review page, and it'll bring you right back to that question itself. So navigating the test is actually a skill that you want to practice while doing your practice tests, because the more you can get around the test easily and comfortably, the better off you're going to be. So here is an example of a score report that you're going to get from the AMC once you do get your test done. So after you do all this and enter all your answers, this does not come until 30 days later. So it's never going to come any earlier. There's no point in checking your email over and over and over and over and over again. You're going to get this when you get it. So just let it go. You know, remember Elsa said it best, let it go, let it go. And so you just want to remember the score report will get it there when it gets there. So, but what it tells you is what your score on the section is. We've seen nothing other than these confident bands of 1 plus or minus 1, basically, and it tells you what your percentile ranking is for each section and for the overall test. And here you can see that like a 5.0, this is a 501, that's about 54th percentile. 54th percentile would be lower than you would want to have to be competitive for most public med schools in your state. So that 508 or 509 I mentioned before is the place you want to be. Other thing to notice is you want a fairly balanced score. So this is pretty consistent up here for these two sections. Not too bad with the 127, although I'd like to see those 128s. But these two sections, the Chem Phys and the Cars, are a little bit low. So you want to try to get your scores to balance out overall so that each of your sub-scores is about the same as all your other sub-scores. That's the most ideal. You do not want to have one or two of the scores being significantly different, like points different. Like in this case, this is 4 and 3 points respectively, different for your Cars and your Chem Phys. So you want something a little bit more balanced is what you're looking for. So we've already given you an indication of what it takes to get into med school as far as target scores, but why? Why do we have to be 80th percentile when the AMC themselves are telling us we should be shooting for a 500 on this test? And the reason why is there's so many more applicants than there are positions right now. So there's about 20,000 folks that are going to get into med school. And there's about 55,000 if you want to, you know, say what it's going to be when you're going to be applying this year. 55,000, my guess is, trying to get in. There's a huge disparity there. Less students are going to get in that are actually applying. Less than half are going to get in, which means you're going to need something more than a 50th percentile. That's why you want to have that 80th percentile. So when it comes to looking at how you're, how you compare to other candidates, you got to be looking at both your GPA and your MCAT score. So put those two together, and if you've got a 3.6 or higher and a 5.08 or higher, then you're pretty competitive, like I said, in most states. When we're talking most states, we're talking most of the U.S. except for states like California, New York, and to some extent a little bit Texas now, because Texas is getting more competitive over time. Although they just had a new med school or two open up there, so things have gotten a little bit different in the environment in Texas since last I looked. Plus, with Texas, if you're anybody here from Texas, you have to deal with the different application system, TXMDAS. So you'll have to deal with that instead of the MCAT system. Or you may even have to apply through both systems. So make sure that you know what the schools are that you want to target, what their GPA and MCAT scores are going to look like for an average applicant. That's where the MSAR can come in handy. Most schools, most of your current undergraduate schools will have copies of that available to you. And you can also get information from websites like ours, princetonreview.com. If you go princetonreview.com/MCAT, there's a service that we actually can, you type in the med schools you're interested in, and we'll give you some of this information that says what the average GPA for the applicants and MCATs for the applicants look like for those schools. It's a good idea just to know what you want before you actually start to get into prepping for the MCAT. Having a good solid target in mind is what you want to do. Alrighty, so let's look at some sample questions here to look at some of the strategies you can use on your actual MCATs when it comes to solving or to attacking the questions that you have on your particular MCAT. So let's start in the Chem Phys section, since that's the first section that comes up. So here we have a passage, pretty short passage, there's no figures in it. This is going to be, I'm going to guess from what I'm seeing in here, since they got elements and they've got lasers and centrifugation, it's probably a chemistry passage. So if I'm going to go through and highlight, I'm going to highlight things like numbers and units, or here, the wavelength change that I see for these two spectra. Notice a lot of your information isn't something I'm too concerned about. Another technique about getting through this passage, besides highlighting key info like the numbers and the units, is doing what we call a map. So the map consists of, on your scratch paper, just saying, okay, in paragraph 1, uranium has 2 isotopes, and they're hard to separate. Paragraph 2 is telling me a little bit about centrifugation. Paragraph 3 is telling me something about this AVLIS detection method, or separation method, I should say. And we can preferentially ionize U-235. That's what it's telling me down here. So when I get to questions, I can use my passage map to help me answer that. It says, okay, with the AVLIS method, how is the ultimate separation likely achieved? Well, first off, these two answers are traps, because we see these wavelengths down here, we're thinking spectra, spectra. But the problem is, and this is a little content that goes a long way, spectra never separate. You cannot separate anything using a spectrum itself. That just tells us what's there. So that means answer choices C and D are immediately incorrect. I can get rid of those, boom, boom, and don't have to worry about those anymore. So now I'm down between density and attracted to a charged plate. Well, my passage map tells me that. Separation by centrifugation, well, A goes with paragraph 2. Separation by this ionization, B goes to paragraph 3. Where is the AVLIS method discussed? Paragraph 3. I can see that right here in my map, and thus my best answer choice is going to be answer choice B, because I know the analytical separation techniques don't separate. Eliminate these two answers, pick my best answer that's remaining behind. Boom, and there you go. It's a very simple structure to a process just called mapping the passage. Identify for some details, summarize each paragraph on your scratch paper, use that map to find your answers. Another type of question comes up like so. And this is like a freestanding question that might come up in maybe within a passage itself or maybe separated from a passage, just in the freestanding chunk. And this is what I like to call a trick question. It looks like there's a lot of work here, and most people will immediately cross off the answer choice A. However, the question is, how much work is done by the magnetic force? I'm going to give you guys a second out there. How much work is done by a magnetic force? Do you guys remember the physics behind this? Because if you're talking about magnetic forces always act perpendicularly. The trick is, that is the answer. The answer choice is A, 0 joules. This is a case of a question that people will try to overwork, a lot of overwork on this one. So slow down, make sure you understand what the question is asking you, and then pick the answer itself. That it's got to be 0 joules because it's magnetic force. Magnetic forces, normal forces, they're going to be doing 0 work. Another type of question that we tend to overwork, Lewis structure questions. This is very clearly a chemistry question. But don't forget the obvious things. This structure should have a charge of -2. That's what the formula tells me. Well, A has a charge of -2. B has a charge of 0. C has a charge of 0. D has a charge of -4. So what's the only answer choice that can be correct without me doing any additional work? It has to be A. Because I know my concept of formal charge. I check my formal charges, make sure they all add up, and thus one of my answers is correct. It looks like a complex question. It looks like it should take me longer to do it, but in the end, it's actually a very simple question. And the Chem Phys questions are usually like this, where they have a little key piece of information that you need to come into the test with and apply it to the solution. So it can take a little bit of work of getting used to that, but you got to think simpler, not more complex. People tend to overthink the questions when we get to the Chem Phys section. All righty. So, oops, I went too far. So here's an example of a car's passage. This passage looks quite dense. And so we're looking at this thing going like, okay, what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to read through this and make sure I am understanding every single paragraph. Well, there's a little trick you can use with cars. Before you start reading the passage, do a couple things. Number one, preview the questions. In the 4th paragraph, Rousseau employs the metaphor of war. So I'm going to pay attention to the 4th paragraph in detail when I read this passage. My next question is used in the passage the term sovereign. So I'm going to look for that term sovereign when I review my passage. Based on the info in the passage, which one of the opinions could most be reasonably ascribed to the author? So something about state, Rousseau, state. So it looks like there's some keywords I want to pay attention to. So if I go back to the passage, I'm going to spend particular attention on this paragraph right here because it did call out the 4th paragraph in detail. I'm also going to be looking for that word state. So I see state here in capital letters. I see state here in capital letter. I see sovereign. That was another keyword I needed to look for. State. So these are terms that I need to pay a lot of attention to when I'm doing my reading. It's where I'm going to spend some time highlighting as well. So let's try to answer some of these questions based on what we just previewed, even in short succession. So the 4th paragraph, we're talking about the metaphor of war, and I see something in my answer choices. And this is something to note. Answer choice A and D are opposites of each other. That is a sure signal that one of those two answers is probably correct. So if I come back to this paragraph 4, they're talking about this kill the vanquished piece that's there, and we're also talking about every malefactor by attacking social rights. or becomes on forfeit a rebel and a traitor. So they're talking about this rebel or traitor and how they fall into this category where we might even want to kill the vanquished, where that person becomes that traitor that could be killed. So if we connect the beginning and end of the paragraph together, we see that this is probably pretty good evidence that B and C are not the answer, either A or D is. And is it a comparison or a contrast? And it seems that it's a comparison, not a contrast, because contrast would have words like instead of or on the contrary, but I'm looking through our paragraph here and I don't see any of those contrasting words. And so what we're looking for here is not so much the meaning as just even key phrases. Contrasting words should be there if there's a contrast. Comparison words are going to be there if there's a comparison. And I see the word like, but I don't see the word instead of. So this is a comparison that becomes our best answer. Comparison instead of contrast. So that's one way to approach our questions. Number 29. As it's used in the passage, the term sovereign refers to the either state, superior judge, being, or king. One of these is different than all the rest. All of these are people. This one is not. Well, let's look around where it's talking about sovereign. So the sovereign, and even its right in this matter is far from clear, and the cases for exercising it are extremely rare. So we're talking about the sovereign with a neutral pronoun, even its right in this matter. Would you refer to a judge, a higher being, or a king as an its? I mean, possibly the higher being, but even with the higher being, we usually traditionally refer to them as being him or a her. So right there, the pronoun its is sort of telling us there that the state is probably our best answer choice. Now we would have to do a thicker read through this thing, a deeper read to make sure we're negating all the rest of the answers. However, because of the pronoun use, that is very good evidence that we can just stick with the word state. So sometimes it's simple things like grammar. Don't forget grammar rules, because grammar rules can tell you a lot about what's being talked about in the passage itself. And then finally, here's an inference question. Based on the info in the passage, which of the following could most be reasonably ascribed to the author? And one of the tasks that we would task you with doing on reading a passage is like basically summarizing the main points of the overall passage. And there's actually a little trick we use. It's usually in the first or last paragraph. So if we go back to the last paragraph here, the main point by the author is pretty clear, but I feel my heart protesting and restraining my pen. Let us leave these questions to the just man who has never offended, and he has never himself stood in need of pardon. So it seems as though the author here is saying about himself that he has been in need of pardon, and he doesn't feel that he's an appropriate person to make a decision about whether or not we should kill these individuals. And if we look at our answer choices, that seems like one of the answer choices specifically. The rights of the individual are more important than the rights of the state. It used those words, but it used them in the middle of the passage. All malefactors have right to rehabilitation. That was discussed in the passage as well, but not the main point. Rousseau feels he's not qualified. That seems almost exactly what that last paragraph is saying, which is usually the main point. And individual rights are always protected. Besides having this extreme word always, which usually negates an answer choice, it's not really, again, in that last paragraph where the main point often is. So our best answer choice turns out to be C. The main point of the passage is what's really what we're looking for our answer here. So looking strategically at different paragraphs, knowing how you would write can help you solve questions very rapidly. So just a few strategies to use in the CAR section. Moving on to bio and biochem. Bio and biochem are looking a lot more experimental than they ever have. They like to give us a lot of data and a lot of figures showing all that data. And so there's quite a few very complex looking figures now, although these in this particular paragraph passage are fairly simple figures, comparatively speaking. But the nomenclature is becoming more of a difficult feature now here even, because we actually have NALP1 and this interleukin 1L, 1 beta. And so we've got all these different like sort of abbreviations and jargon words that are meant to keep us on our toes. The key is don't get all caught up in this. Usually in the bio questions, they're asking about specific things. For example, this question here, according to the passage, how is the activity of interleukin 1 beta regulated? So we got to look back to the passage and find out where they're talking about that. So interleukin 1 beta, there's where it is. Active interleukin 1 beta. Before that, it is pro-interleukin 1 beta. So if we see that scenario, we have a pro-interleukin, that's a zymogen, and active is the active form. Let's check out our answers. Phosphorylated by a phosphatase. Now, while that could be true, because that's one of the ways we might activate a zymogen, we know that we're looking specifically for a zymogen here. Allosteric inhibition, that doesn't seem like activation. It seems like regulation, so it could go in there, but again, it's not necessarily specifically because it was produced as a zymogen, pro-interleukin. Translated in the ER and secreted via vesicular transport, that's not regulation, that's just simply where it's going to end up. And then, of course, D is our best answer because we knew it's pro-interleukin 1 beta. We have to activate it in order for it to work. So the most regulatory process there is synthesizing it as a zymogen because it's not going to do its job until after we've done something to it. Another question that we might run into could say, synthesis who hypothesizes the NALP1 mutation in vitiligo may lead to death of melanocytes. Which of the following is one mechanism by which this will occur? So this is what we call a 2x2 question. We have over, and under expression. And then we've got lower, higher, lower levels of interleukin 1 beta. So how can we tell which one is which? Well, there's some experimental data we had in our hopper here. So I look at the experimental data. In my vitiligo patients, it looked like I had more NALP1 than I had in my controls. So I have more NALP1 than I have in my controls. Then, am I looking at over or under expression? I can simplify it down to overexpression of NALP1. So I know right there that underexpression and underexpression are incorrect. Then if I look at the method of how NALP1 works, according to the passage, it's got leads to lower levels or leads to higher levels. Well, if they're saying that the NALP1 mutation is going to lead to the death of melanocytes, it's got to be higher levels of interleukin 1 beta. Why is that? We go back to our passage and it tells us that the interleukin 1 beta serves as an inflammatory cytokine, and then it's secreted in expression of adhesion factors on endothelial cells, induces fever by initial signal transduction. So it looks like that this is actually this interleukin 1 beta process involved in the activation of white blood cells. White blood cells is probably going to lead to killing off of cells, so our best answer choice is going to be higher levels of interleukin 1 beta, increasing the movement of T lymphocytes, leading to increased level of T cell mediated melanocytes. So again, just taking little pieces of information from throughout the passage is the way we attack these things. Now, question 6 that we see here. Additional experiments were conducted on the genomic DNA isolated from the Langerhans cells, Given the results in Table 1 and Experiment 2, which of the following can be true of this mutation? So, mutation is a nonsense mutation. We attack these by true-falsing Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3. It's a nonsense mutation. Well, we know that that's not a correct answer because if it was a nonsense mutation, I would see no difference between vitiligo and the controls. So we see a difference. and we see that there's a different amount of NALP1 that's present, so 1 is false, we would write that on our scratch paper. The mutation is in the promoter region of the NALP1 gene. So if I have more of the NALP1, then it seems reasonable that it's in the promoter for the NALP1 gene. That could be a reasonable answer, so 2 is true. I would mark that on my scratch paper. The mutation resulting in ALP1 phenotype could be in the gene for another protein. So could this be possible that the mutation is in another gene, a gene for another protein? And actually, given the fact that in the experiment 2, it's telling us that when we compare the proteins, it was found that both of them have the same exact NALP protein. So if there is some kind of mutation, it must not be affecting NALP itself, but something else about the NALP. So that would say 3 is true, and therefore I could eliminate based on 1 being false, answer choice C, 2 being true, answer choice B, 3 being true, answer choice A, meaning my best answer is going to be D. So a few of the things that you can take home here is just be systematic and make sure you're identifying the details in the passage that are associated with the questions. What we're doing here is we're just going back and rereading now. So one of the rules of thumb for science passages I suggest for all of you is don't spend the time reading the passage so much as just getting the lay of the land like we do with the chemistry passage. That's the same thing we do here. Just find key information because you're going to end up having to read in more detail later on. So you have to change what you're looking for based on the question. You can't know in advance everything that you're going to need to know to answer all the questions. All righty. So let's look at a handful of questions. I'm going to skip these questions here, and we'll look at a handful of questions here in the Psych-Soc section. So Psych-Soc is a little bit different in the reading comprehension land in that it's actually a lot easier to read usually. There's not as much fancy terminology. They're usually just describing some kind of a study or some kind of ailment and having you figure out experimental details, honestly. There's a lot of that. Also asking about simply scientists and their theories and how they apply to what's in the passage itself. So when I'm going through, I see, okay, based on the results of the study, what can be most reasonably concluded about the efficacy of CBT for IBS sufferers who do not have an anxiety disorder? So efficacy questions, they're usually going to be about a figure. So I look at my figure and I see there's one bar that's different than all the rest, right here. So the one bar that's different than all the rest, it looks like CBT with the non-anxiety folks had a % reduction of IBS that was very low as compared to those with the anxiety. Even when you're looking at these two, they're more comparison. In fact, this is almost as low as no treatment itself. So that's almost certainly the answer to this question. So CBT is more effective, most effective, not as effective, or equally effective. And I would say that it looks to be by this bar that is less effective, which means my only answer choice could be not as effective as meditation. So just pulling information right from the graph, picking it up right on the question itself, that's all we'll have to do with a lot of these Psych-Soc questions. Other types of Psych-Soc questions you run into might be, this has nothing really to do in the passage. This is just freestanding about how do you interpret what they're saying about the experimental design. The average individual group is diagnosed with IBS is 40 to 50, who is white, educated, married, middle to upper class. Based on this info, what might you conclude about IBS? It's underdiagnosed in less affluent populations. So this is an affluent population. This seems like it could be a reasonable answer. IBS rarely affects younger men and women. Well, this doesn't tell us that. In fact, it might tell us that it doesn't affect, it could tell us that it doesn't affect older men, but not necessarily younger men or women. Causal relationship between education status and IBS. Correlation does not equal causation. This is almost never going to be correct anytime you see it. Get rid of things like C. And then age, gender, race, and marital status should all be viewed as risk factors. Do we know which of these things led to the IBS sufferer? No. So in fact, usually these questions are about something that is missing or something is being misinterpreted. And that means our best answer is A, IBS is underdiagnosed in less affluent populations. So this really has nothing to do with what's in the passage. It's just you understanding what experimentally should be looking for about what's a good variable and what's a bad variable, or what's a misunderstood variable, or a confounding variable, to use the vernacular. And then, given the description of the study in the passage, which unknown factor might have the most influence on the validity of these results? This question is so common as to be cliche, because it is almost always going to be the same answer. One of the biggest things that they do with the questions here when it comes to experimental design is they're always going to have sample size, because the bigger the sample, the better or less applicable or validity, or how should I say that? If I have a bigger sample size, will the validity of the results be higher or lower? And the answer to that one is always higher. If I have more individuals, I'm going to have a better sample size. I'm going to have a better experiment overall. My validity will always increase. So even before I did anything else, I'm pretty sure the answer here is going to be sample size. But duration of IBS symptoms, if I go back to them describing this, it seems like they've made sure these folks are doing 6-month studies, so duration doesn't seem to be a problem. The next answer there is participants' previous exposure to medications treat IBS, and it doesn't seem that they had much exposure to other medications, so I'm not even sure if that would be something necessarily a good choice. It could be an appropriate answer, but sample size is always better than most other answer choices there. And then length of treatment protocols, again, they did a long-term study here in the sense of 6 months. That's pretty long in the whole grand scheme of things. So overall, sample size is going to be the best answer choice. And sample size is almost always the best answer choice. And then finally, some of the questions they also do ask is, how might some scientist that has developed some theories, how might they think about the stuff that's presented in the passage? And again, while it seems like this is passage-based, it really has nothing to do with the passage itself, because we got to know, what did Freud do? He was a psychoanalyst, and when he was doing his psychoanalysis, he'd often bring in id, ego, superego into his discussions. Things like that. So looking at my answer choices, by helping the patient discover the physical cause, that really wasn't his way. Psychoanalysis, definitely his way. Group therapy, again, not something that Freud was fond of doing. He always worked one-on-one with patients. And then D, Dr. Freud would be unlikely to treat an IBS sufferer because he said it would not be a psychological cause. He thought everything was related to some kind of family or familial relationship. So what we'd be seeing here is our best answer choice is psychoanalysis, because that's Freud's most that's the answer choice that most appropriately fits Sigmund Freud's ideas, the way he did analyses. So a lot of these questions in Psych-Soc don't even relate back to the passage. So again, don't actually spend too much time with the passage itself. Spend more time here trying to go back and make sure you need the passage in the first place. But a lot of the Psych-Soc questions are coming from your own knowledge of these individual scientists and experimental design. So that's just a lot of fast, rapid-fire techniques, tricks of the trade of how we can do things with the test. There's a lot of other things that Bridge Review can do for you to actually, help you improve on your med school dreams here. And so that is our job, is to help you get into med school. So what is it that we can do to help you out? Well, there's 3 components to this. Number 1 is helping you get good grades. Number 2, getting good test scores. Number 3, helping out with your application. Today we're talking about the test scores, but that is by no means what the limit of what we do for students. Number 1, we provide you free practice tests. If you actually head to our site and if you haven't taken a practice test yet, a good way to do it is just look for the free practice MCAT on princetonview.com/MCAT, and you can just get a good view of what the test looks like and how it's going to feel. We are doing a lot of different more admission webinars on med admissions coming up here over the next months. I think Valerie might have the next one in mind that she can share with you a little bit later. We offer our pre-med GPA booster, which is actually what we call our homework help. So let's talk about our homework help. We will help you with things like biochemistry. We will help you with things like your paper that's due for your psych class or your soc class. You end up buying hours, 3 hours at a time, and you can meet with our tutors any time of the day. They're there at 3 in the morning. They're there at 2 in the afternoon. If you need help all of a sudden on just like a homework assignment that's due, they can help you out with that. So this is available all the time, 24/7, and it's just basically to help you make sure your GPA stays at that 3.6 or above level. Second thing we do is test prep. We have test prep options across the board. We've got our ultimate classes, which are going pretty much all the time, online or in person, depends on where you live. We also have our immersion class, which is occurring this summer in Orlando, Florida, San Diego, California, or Austin, Texas. So, and I will be at all 3 of those, checking in with every single one of those things. So they're always an interesting class. It's like MCAT boot camp. You're eating, breathing, and drinking MCAT while you're there. And if those options don't work for you, we also do private tutoring in person and online. So private tutoring works for those of you who have basically got a good idea of what you're strong or weak in already, and you don't really want help on all the tests, just maybe one section or one subject of one section. And then we also offer med school admissions counseling. Our resident expert, her name is Dr. Nita Pardue, and she actually used to be a admissions advisor for several schools on the East Coast for med schools, and she helps us out in like helping our students understand what is this application process all about. What are all of the different things that go into having a good application? Like, what do you need to do to get good letters of rec? What's that personal statement going to look like? So we have a lot of different offerings there. We help you out from, you know, just prepping things out to completing your primaries, completing your secondaries, completing just getting ready for your interviews, which is like, that's that scary moment that you know you've almost got it, and all you can do is screw it up at that point. We will help you get prepared so that you don't have any fears. You walk in there confident and convinced you are going to do awesome. So these are a lot of things that we can do for you, and there is certainly more that we can do for you as well. So I'm going to open up another poll here. And it's just if you want to get more information about some of our options here for helping you prep for the MCAT. And while we're doing that poll, they're going to read through some of these questions and help me figure out which questions I still need to answer. So far, you guys have been great. Hope I've answered a few questions for you, shed a few lights on the subject of prepping for your MCAT. So it looks like we're about 60% in. %70 in. Got about 80% voted, 86% voted. Let's get it up to around 90, and we can move on to some questions. Alrighty, so it looks like most of us are looking for med school admissions help and prepping for the MCAT here. Not entirely unexpected. So, alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and close this up, and then I'm going to pass it back to Valerie so she can let me know which questions that I need to be answering. So, Valerie?
All right, thanks so much, Doug, for that section-by-section MCAT plan of attack. So it looks like we do have a couple of questions from our attendees. So the first one that came in is, if I'm applying this cycle, is taking an August test really late? I want to test as late as possible, but still have my app be seen with priority. Any thoughts on that?
Okay, good question. That actually, if you're trying to apply this cycle, doing the MCAT in August is actually pretty late because your application will not get processed until September, until that score actually goes in. So if you can get it done any sooner, that would be better, because since med schools do rolling admissions, the best time to have your MCAT done is like no later than June, because that way, once your application is complete, you turn it in June, your score comes in early July, and then bam, it's in that first rotation. If you take an August test, it's pushing it back till September, and if you take the September test, it's pushing it back until October.
All right, great. Thanks for that. All right, so another question that came in is, how important is it to take biochemistry before taking the MCAT?
That's a good question. Biochemistry, while it's on the MCAT, isn't like hardcore on the MCAT. It's not like you have to memorize every process, every cycle, every process for answering questions here, because a lot of times they'll also give you the diagram. They'll diagram out one of the cycles. They'll diagram out, say, Krebs cycle, and ask you questions about it. And a lot of these things that you're going to get asked, you will cover in general bio, at least in some amount. Now, if you take biochemistry, it's definitely going to help. It won't hurt you to take it. But if you actually are confident in your ability to study up on your own, you should be able to get away without having a full-on biochemistry course.
Okay, thanks for that. All right, so someone else wrote in, conversely, if I'm applying next year, is taking the MCAT this September too early? I don't really want to study for the MCAT during the school year, but I might benefit from the additional time. Thoughts on that, Doug?
So you're applying next cycle, from what I understand, and so you're taking the September test this year for your application that's going to be due next in 2018. So that's not too early unless you haven't had all your prereqs. The basic thing I want you to always remember is make sure your prereqs are done before you take your MCAT, because if you're missing, say, physics or organic chemistry, those are usually one of the two that can severely damage your chem phys score. So if it's not a problem if you've got most of your prereqs done or got all your prereqs done by September to take the test in September, but do definitely consider making sure you got that last physics class or the last OChem class under your belt first.
All right, thanks for that input, Doug. So someone else wrote in asking if you had any suggestions on how to manage pre-test anxiety.
Ooh, that's a big one, pre-test anxiety. Couple things, actually. Number one, don't talk or don't study with a friend that's also taking the MCAT. I know that seems weird. You should probably study with friends, but don't study with a friend who's taking the MCAT, because what ends up happening is creating more anxiety. You start competing with that friend, and I've seen many of friends break up, like become non-friends because of studying over the MCAT, and it just creates all kinds of anxiety and animosity between different individuals. So don't study with MCAT friends. Other things, just like part of it is just being able to let go a little bit of this is the most important test in the world type thing. You know, I've actually had people celebrate what I call their 508 party. So they throw themselves a party for all their friends, and they put up a banner, I got a 508 on my MCAT. This is before they've even taken the MCAT. And it just basically creates the sense of like, well, yeah, I can do this. I got this. There's no real trouble with doing it because I already told people I'm doing it, so I have to do it. A lot of it's just knowing you're going to do well. And then practice. Reading, writing notes, taking notes, rewriting notes, summarizing books doesn't prepare you to do well. That creates a lot of like concern because like I don't know how it's going to look. That's why you've got to take practice test after practice test and do practice problem after practice problem, because the more you do that, the more you're like, I've seen this before. I got this. I know how it's going to work. So practice, lots and lots of practice. Be confident, throw yourself a 508 party, and don't study what somebody else is doing the MCATs, because those are all three ways to start building that tearing down that pre-test anxiety.
All right, I think we have time for maybe about 2 or 3 more, Doug. All right, so someone else wrote in, why is it bad to have one section with a way higher or lower score than the rest?
Way lower, I think, is fairly self-explanatory in the sense that it says, like, oh, you've got one score that is not competitive with the others. They'll wonder why. The admissions committees will say, why is this one section lower than all the rest? Particularly if it's the cars section, too. If your cars section is the one that's way lower than all the rest, then they're going to go like, wow, this is not a balanced candidate. They've got a very big weakness that we need to fix. Way higher, having one section that's way higher than the others, it's kind of likewise, why are they doing so well in this one section but not on all the rest? And it's a question that's going to come up if you get to the interview stage. They're definitely going to ask you about that. Why was your psych-so score so much higher than all your other sections? Do you just not know those as well? And you don't want to be faced with that kind of a question. So basically, having a balanced score gives them less material to question your score overall.
All right, thanks. All right, so 2 more. What is considered a good competitive score for the new MCAT?
Competitive score for the new MCAT does depend on what you plan on doing with it. But if you're planning on going to an in-state school, then 508 to 509 is a good competitive score. That is, if you're applying to all the in-state schools that you have available to you, you'll almost certainly get an interview with one of them. If you're going to, say, go out of state, you need to tack on 5 to 6 points on top of that. If you're going to be going to a private school, you need to tack on 5 to 6 points on top of that. If you're going to a private out-of-state school, tack on 10 to 12 points on top of that. It just gets more difficult when you start going in private and out of state. So 508, 509 for most states, the Californias, the New Yorks, and probably the Texases right now, more like a 509, 510, 511. It's eking upwards in those more competitive states.
All right, sounds good. So we'll do one more question, and then like I mentioned to you guys, we will definitely have one of our med admissions experts get back to each and every one of you whose question we did not have the opportunity to answer tonight. All right, so one more question. All right. Will it look bad on my application if I take the MCAT more than once?
Only if the score stays the same, goes down, or doesn't go up enough. If you are going to take the MCAT more than once, the goal is it has to go up at least 4 to 5 points between times. That's more than it used to be, but that's because there's more points on the test now. But the reason being is, number one, you don't ever want the score to go down. Worse yet, though, is often that the score stays the same, because then, even if you did get an interview, which becomes less likely in that case, they're definitely going to say, why did you retake this thing and just get the same score? So, if you retake, it has to go up, and it has to go up significantly to make it not affect you in a negative way.
All right, thanks so much, Doug. So it looks like that's all the time we have for questions, but if you happen to think of any other questions after tonight's webinar, feel free to drop us a line at questions@review.com. And like I said, we will definitely be following up with each and every one of you whose questions we weren't able to answer tonight. All right, so one more thing. As a reminder, you'll all be receiving an email with a link to tonight's recording, so don't worry if there was a portion that you weren't able to hear tonight. We'll definitely be following up with that recording. And if you'd like to check out our other upcoming webinars, head on over to princetonreview.com webinars to check those out. Our next med admissions related webinar is actually about how to craft a compelling personal statement. So for those of you who are applying this cycle, this might actually come in handy for you. And that webinar is on May 30th at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard. All right, so thank you again, Doug, for sharing all of your awesome MCAT wisdom with us tonight. And thank you to all of you for joining us. All right, goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, guys.